Okay, so for anybody who may or may not be here, this is the new stream. If you're wondering why I sound different, it's because I have not cut my hair in a long time. Or because I'm on a PC, not sure. But since I'm on a PC, a lot of things that were probably rather smooth in previous streams are going to be all kinds of rough. So that's okay. It's not really that big of a deal. It's just I'm not a PC person. Not that much of a Mac person either. It's just I got used to it. But that's okay. What we're going to find out is that for the most part, most of what we're learning in basic prep doesn't really require operating system fluency or a specific one, because we're mostly just working here inside of Learn, or I've got a replit open. I managed to forget my password, so this is just like a public replit. I'm not actually signed in. I didn't forget my password, I just wrote it down somewhere, and I have lost where I wrote it down. So ostensibly, forgot it. But for anybody in the chat, if we could get some kind of like audio levels, excuse me, sound okay, visual levels seem okay. We're going to start out with a nice, fancy console.log, hello world. And then we're going to turn off code intelligence because I don't like code intelligence. Code intelligence is when you start writing a function and it's like, ooh, do you want a function or this or a focus event? And it's like, I want any of that. I also changed it to dark theme, but I don't really have any reasoning behind that either. But anyway, it's also entirely possible that those of you who are on here are not aware of how we usually do things, or it might be the case that I forgot to turn off the chat inside of YouTube. But in any case, the chat is mostly going to be taking place on Slack. There should be a link in the description of this video on YouTube or the stream on YouTube that will direct you there if you're not already on there. Feel free to send me a direct message. I think it's just David Coleman, one word. Yeah, send me a direct message if you have a question that you're like, I would really rather not say this, publicly. That's cool. I will probably say your question out loud. I will never read your name, though. So Slack is going to kind of remain sort of like a closed box. Inside of Slack, you're, hopefully going to remain anonymous. But we'll try to get to your questions. Yeah, have at it. If anybody has any questions, please let me know. I'll try to stay around for like an hour, but I might get frustrated because, I'm really bad on a PC, and so we'll see how that goes. Also, I didn't actually say that it was going to start until 6:30, so possibly people are waiting for that. Or it's also possible that because I didn't do the stream for the last like 3 or 4 weeks or something, nobody knows about it, which is fine too. You want to figure that low impact, high output kind of things are what we're about here in basic prep. You'll notice they would try to fill every portion of it with videos and walkthroughs and solutions and all that kind of stuff, because basic prep in and of itself is not really anything to speak to. It's just a collection of resources, but what you use those resources for is what we're here for, right? Passing a technical interview, mostly passing a technical interview aimed at some sort of like a coding boot camp. Not that there's necessarily that vast of a difference between the style of technical interview for a coding bootcamp and a technical interview you would see if you were applying to a job. There are some differences, but the main idea is just trying to deliver your thoughts and your coding skills in a easily understandable and digestible format for whoever you're coding for. So what we'll do here, if we get any questions, is answer those. But if we don't, I'll probably just start working through some challenges, give you some tips on ways that you can figure out what the the code quote tests are saying to you. Although I would love 1 or 2 like thumbs up just to make sure that the audio levels are going right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want to turn that up a little bit. Well, we'll see. But anyway, anybody feel free to send a question over on the chat, and in about 5 minutes I'm going to go ahead and get started and just start working on some problems. If you have any questions related to Hack Reactor, Galvanize, my experience therein, I'm not a huge fan of going over my experience just because I think it's a bad idea for people to attach themselves to the experience of others too often, just because, you're not really like anybody else. You might have some similarities, and if you're here, you have a similar predilection towards coding or programming. But in terms of how you would solve a problem, it's probably not exactly the same as anybody else. So the same way that applies, the the place that you get a job after coding boot camp is not looking for, well, how do you say this? It's like once they get you, that was who they were going for. So, if you talk to one of your friends and they had a certain experience, or you talk to one of your, I don't want to say enemies, but just somebody that you don't really buy and they had a certain experience, it's not always indicative of an experience that you might have. And a lot of times with these boot camps, it's about what you put into it and your ability to manage your emotions while you're going through it, because to be sure, the hard part of the coding boot camp is not necessarily the code so much as it is just the grind. Our coding boot camp, what do they call it? Software engineering immersive program, goes from 9 in the morning to 8 at night, and then I think they let you out early, 5:30 on Saturdays. So if you've never done something like that before, it's in and of itself a rather formidable task, just to do the same thing. Now, of course, you're not going to be doing the same thing. They break up the day rather nicely, and you're in a cohort of people, whether you're in a remote fashion or live online or in person or whatever. You're with a bunch of people, so it's not like you're alone. Because if you had to, locked in a room, you get from 9 to 8 to try to do something. I feel like a lot of people would have difficulty with that. I know I did, because that's what's been going on. I did the self-study prepare, but how do I get the materials downloaded? I'm afraid I have no idea what that means, which is not necessarily a commentary on your question so much as it is, if you're talking about premium prep, this has nothing to do with premium prep, except for the fact that we're both offered by the same company. If you're talking about stuff for premium prep, then you might want to holler at somebody in that program. If I have misunderstood your question, please clarify, because I would love to help you get whatever materials you're looking for, but there really isn't anything to download. You go to the site, you sign up for the course. If you're having trouble signing up for the course inside of Slack, there should be a link to let you sign up there. Of course, somebody took it out. Okay, that's no big deal. If you need that, go ahead and let me know. I'll give you the link to sign up for the course. But if you go to our website and just click on the free course, that's where it's going to take you anyway. It looks like there might be a question. Nope. What I'm looking at is just another student had jumped onto a thread that I had answered a student's question for and given them additional materials. You're going to see that a lot. What we try to encourage is that if you know partial answers, or if you know an answer to a question, hop on there and give your opinion. It's usually a good idea to try to throw some sort of like a "this is my opinion" buffer whenever you say something you're not entirely sure about. But especially as you're, getting started with programming, hearing from other people who are having difficulty can be very, very edifying. Not edifying. What would be a word for this? Not edifying, but reassuring, possibly. Sometimes when you see those fancy coding tutorials, of which this is not one, the person coding has really, really, knows their stuff, has been at it for a while. They've got a bunch of preferences. They've got everything saved. They have hotkeys everywhere. And so they fly around with, a speed that can almost seem intimidating. And so what we do is, for these free prep stuff, is that it's not that. It's kind of almost the opposite. There's tons of mistakes. You'll notice that the videos tend to have a little bit of a one-take quality, and that's for two reasons. One is that they are all completely one take. And also, I didn't know how to edit videos when I first started them. And so I came up with a bunch of reasons why that was okay, and I think the end result is kind of nice, because a lot of times there'll be like an error, and it's like, oh no. But the point would be is that sometimes the first time you see an error, you get an infinite loop, you do something like that, it can be a little debilitating to your confidence to think like, oh no, I did something terrible. But it's like, everybody makes errors all the time. A lot of software engineering has to do with how you propagate and deliver and communicate those errors. So yeah. For the person who was asking about downloading the materials, I hope I did not scare you away. And if there is something that you would like to clarify in a direct message or in another message, please let me know. However, it is 6:30. It is the witching hour, as it were. So I think I might go ahead and do the placement challenge. I've never actually done that live on, anything. So maybe we'll just go ahead and do that. Decide where to start with our placement challenge. I was going to click that. Takes me to the placement challenge. Okay, cool. So, yeah, you can read this at your leisure. Placement challenge is basically just a way to figure out if you need to do the entire course or if you'd be better off skipping to a certain section. So for these oh man, the scroll is different. Oh boy. Okay. So the first one says create a string. I'm very likely going to get tired of this placement challenge after about 3 of these, but we'll do 3 just to see if it works. Declare a variable, call it myString, and assign it to any string of your choosing. Okay. Declaring a variable is as simple as using the var keyword. You'll also see people talk about something called let and something called const. My advice is to worry about that after you get a good sense of what var is doing. But that's just advice. Some people find it's much easier to just jump right in with let. The differences has to do with something called scope and then the ability to change that variable once you've created it. It doesn't really have that much of a significant application at this point, just because we're writing basically functions, and we write one function for things, so we don't have a ton of applicability for let and const, but they do exist. And you'll also notice that sometimes you'll look up documentation, and rather than being written using let or const, it has var, so that's why all of that is still in here. Not my array, my string. This spelling format, where we do the first letter lowercase of the first word, and then all the rest of the words are uppercase, is called camel case. This is in opposition to my string. Did I do something weird here with like the cursor, or has it always been like that? Anyway, my string is equal to, I feel like that looks different than it usually does. It's usually not the below cursor, it's like the above cursor. But we'll say above cursor. And when we run the test, we could put a semicolon there. And we run the test. It's going to take a little bit longer than the other tests, and that's because these aren't local. It sort of had to trick the test into thinking that what was happening is what we wanted to happen. Hooray. Create an array. Same story. We'll say var my array. It is different. How did I get a little under cursor? Oh, whatever. Is equal to an array with 1, 2, and 3. So it's got 3 elements. It's an array. If we hit run tests, we're going to, it'll say pass. Oh, that's kind of cool. So it gives you 2 options here. Command plus enter is how you would do it if you were on a Mac OS operating system, and control enter is how you would do it if you are on a PC, which I actually am on a PC now. Not permanently. The Mac that I had was getting very, very like when I would do the stream, and it would start to get really, really hot, and so I was, I didn't want to break it because I actually borrowed it from my mom, of all people, to go to Maker Square, which is what HackReactor was called. Well, no, it wasn't called that. HackReactor acquired Maker Square right after I finished, but they had very similar programs. Anyway, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. And yep, I thought it would take 3. It took 2. I'm already bored with these introductory ones. Concatenate 2 strings. That's kind of nice. So what you can do here is we have 2 inputs, string 1 and string 2. The function takes those 2 as parameters and should return a string which is the result of concatenating the 2 input strings together. So concatenating strings is a pretty simple process, and we can do it in one line. We could say return string 1 plus string 2. That's it. Hit run down here, and this one's going to go a little bit faster. It should, and we did it correctly. String interpolation. String interpolation is a way to input the value of a variable into a string. And there's a couple different ways to do it. I'm going to show you the old school way, and then we're going to look at a new way that was recently introduced in, I guess it wasn't recent at all. It was 2015, which is not recent. It's relative. So it looks like what we want to do is we want to return this message. And what we're looking at here is an example of what would happen if we ran the code, provided that we actually wrote the function. So after we've written interpolate, something like this is going on behind the scenes, and it's going to give us a way to sort of like pre-test our function. I'm not going to go into that now, but this is something that you want to keep in mind if you're having trouble. You can take these over to like Replit, or you could open up a console inside of the browser you're working on, and then take your function after you write it, and then run it there first, just to see if it works in at least one case. So for this one, it looks like we want to have a string that's like my favorite food is, and then whatever the food is. And so the first way that we're going to do this, it's like if I hit the arrow keys, it makes it like an underscore thing. But I can't get it back. Whatever. That's going to bother me more than it should, but let's just forget about it for now. Copy this, come down and paste it. So that expression on line 3 is essentially the result of the function we want. So if we just, why is it doing that? Oh man, PC is not happy with me right now. Let's go Control Z. All right. Oh boy. we're in trouble here. I have no idea how to fix that, but that's okay. So we'll go ahead and control. Okay, so this is going to be on difficult mode because we're never going to be able to write anything except for the first section of the line, which that's going to be tricky, but who cares? So we'll say return my favorite food is, and then plus favorite, oh you rascal. Okay, so that should be the answer, except I spelled something wrong. Oh, good, this is perfect. So what you're seeing here is the result of an automated test case going wrong. And so what it's telling you is it's saying, I expected this, which is my code, or basically what my code produced, to equal, it says to deeply equal. Deeply equal is something you don't want to worry about. It's just a function of the way that the tests are written. But it basically means it should be equal to, this is what I'm expecting to have when I ran the code with the input that was here. So if you look at this, this is what I want, and this is what I got. And if you carefully parse it, you'll notice that there's an exclamation point missing from mine. So the exclamation point should be here. It is not. So what we're going to do is we're going to say plus. Oh, good Lord. It's going to delete that, isn't it? Yep. Space plus an exclamation point. And there we go. Cool. So the other way that we could do this is that there's something called string interpolation as part of ES6. Can you please expand, maximize your window on the stream? It's difficult to see currently. Oh, good. I was hoping there would be problems like this that people would bring up. Well, I guess I wasn't hoping there would be a problem. It was more just like, I hope somebody would say something about it. Expand, minimize your window on the stream. Oh, maybe we could just make it bigger. Plus, like that. I think to solve the cursor problem, you have to find the insert key. Ooh. Insert. Aha! Excellent work. Well, I'm not going to say your name because I said that I wasn't going to, but thank you very much for that, because that is exactly what it was. I wonder how I got there, though. That's not it. Okay, but either way, we're going to go through this a little quicker. It's string interpolation for ES6 is something like, you use 2 backticks, and so these are now like, this is a string. So what I can do is I can say my favorite food is, and then this little $ curly braces is essentially a way to say, take the value of whatever variable I put inside of here, and then, put it as part of the string. So if you look at line 3 and line 4, you could see why people would prefer this. Let me say it like this. You might be able to see why people would prefer this. What this also references is that there's a lot of other programming languages that use this exact paradigm. So that happens a lot in JavaScript, where JavaScript doesn't have something, people complain about it, and JavaScript devs are like, all right, well now it has that. What's your problem now? Which kind of makes me laugh. It just always makes me think of JavaScript developers as this very sassy bunch that's always waiting with another feature to kind of just like, not to help people, but just to like, quiet the haters. I know it's not what they're doing, but that's just how I picture it. Ah, good, a whole bunch of activity. Expand the capture window. Expand the capture window in blue in your OBS. First things first, is anybody else having that problem? Because if this is a multiple person problem, I think it becomes more important. But it's important nevertheless. Expand the blue window. I think the blue window should be... It should be the whole screen though, right? So are you not seeing the whole screen? Like, can you not see like the placement challenge title up here and all the stuff on the bottom? lot of dead space on the stream. Oh, you know what I could do? I'm actually on 2 different computers right now because I'm doing this Slack on. This is 100% for one. Thank you very much for clarifying that. Let me see what I can do on that. Because I was picturing that something like this was likely to happen. Oh, good lord, that looks hideous. Okay, okay. Excellent, excellent suggestion, or not suggestion, but like, what do you call it? All right. Oh, go on then. All right. How are we looking? Okay, that looks a little better. All right, back to the chat. What are we thinking? Ah, excellent. Thank you very much. Well, you know who you are. Okay, cool. So we have sorted that out. Thank you very much for saying that. I guess we could probably make this a little smaller again. How are we feeling for size? Does this give people a good enough impression about like what the code is, or is it a little too big? Well, anyway, let's go ahead and solve another problem. This is one of those problems where it's essentially just like, hey, you're going to write a function that's going to do something that a method could do. And you're just going to have the function only do the method. And the method for this one is index of. You can have a string. You can check for the presence of another string within that by checking the index of it, which is cool. And so what do we want? We want the actual index. So in that case, we're just going to return string1.index of string 2. And I don't love when people do things like, well, you should know how important this is because the other day I was programming and I did this, this, and that. But index of is actually super, super, super useful. It's just a good idea to keep in mind that index of is a way to determine if another string is present within a string before you start, slicing or substringing or whatever you would do. Split a string into an array. This is another one of those methods that I try to put as many instances of as possible in the course, because if you can go from data types to other data types, and you know functions, and you know loops, and you know conditionals, you're pretty much okay. Like, there's not a ton of other things that you would need to be able to do. And there might be some stuff, but that's like the meat and potatoes of basic prep, is like, we're going to do some functions. The functions are going to have styles of input that are going to range in a couple of data types, and then the data is going to be manipulated in ways that can usually be simulated with, or not simulated, but recreated, with like a for loop or a conditional. And I could show you what I mean, probably with like index of, but maybe later. So for this one, same idea. We're just going to return string.split. String.split is a method that's going to allow us to break up a string into an array, and we can tell split to break it up in a very specific fashion. We can tell it to say, hey, whenever you see a space, break it into like its own individual element in the array. So if we did this, we're going to get an incorrect answer. It's going to be like, nope, what you gave us back was something that we weren't looking for. You gave us this, what we were looking for was this. So oddly enough, I think we get the same result if we forget to put anything in split at all. Like if we were to say split and just forget to put anything inside of there, which is to say we call this method split with no arguments. We get that same result, which is kind of odd, but is what it is. And so what we actually want is we want to say an empty string, and it just has to do with the way split works, and then we're going to get what we want. All right, remove from back. I'm not sure that this is 100% useful to keep going through the placement challenge one by one, so let's skip to some fun stuff. Ooh, splice. A lot of times you're going to see a problem like this. I have a couple problems in here that are sort of similar, and all we're doing is trying to figure out how to get you used to a new method using tactics that you've already employed. So we already have an idea of how to write a function. We already have an idea of how to interact with the parameters of that function. So all a question like this is doing is basically being like, let's walk you through how you might use splice. So using splice, you know, spoiler alert. We'll take 4 parameters, an array, an integer start, an integer delete count, and a string item. Your function should splice the input array, starting at the input start, deleting delete count items, and inserting them into the array at start. Oh, inserting item. I was like, that's a way different problem. Deleting the items and then reinserting them is a little bit like, that's not trivial. And inserting them into the array at start, your function need not return anything. Okay, so all we're doing here is we're just going to call splice, and there's 2 things that we could do. One is we could let the question kind of guide us. If we're going to use splice, and it gives us splice is a method for an array, it's a decent shot to just say something like array.splice start delete count item. Just because that's the way that I wrote a lot of these problems. I don't really want to trick you at this point. It's mainly like, there's a thing called splice. It'll do almost essentially, or almost exactly what I'm describing if you just put them in order. So that's one version. The other version would be, which is probably what you should do, go to mdn.splice. We go to mdn.splice, or, well, this is the placement challenge, so you probably wouldn't know about it yet, but there's a section inside of the course, oh, where did I put it? I think it's in functions of module 0. And the reason would be, yeah, all the docs. So what we would do with all the docs would be something like Control F, which is to say find, and we'll look for, what we look for, splice. And so splice, it looks like has a couple of entries here. And if we scroll down to removing and adding elements, it looks like this is another place where we could find out how to use the splice method. So you'll notice that there's a lot of different ways to get through this course, and that's on purpose, because there's a lot of ways to be a software engineer. So you don't want to necessarily write yourself off if one thing that you see me do isn't something that you're like a super big fan of. A lot of times, it's just because that's what works for me. Sweet. So, no questions still, which is okay. Perhaps it is just so, what's it called? Well, let's not speculate about that. So what we might do, what was somebody asking about the other day? Oh, I know. Nah. Well, actually, let's get a vote in the chat. Would we rather start messing with some higher order functions because we feel very advanced, or would we like to do some more basic problems because we are feeling kind of unsure and want to see the basics? Now I'm going to wait maybe 2 minutes and see what's up. Because one of the things it used to be, the Hack Reactor interview used to be, here's a blank page and like an hour, write a functional version of each map, filter, and reduce. And by that, of course, we mean like, for each is a function that already exists in JavaScript. Higher order functions. The crowd calls for higher order functions. Sweet, let's do higher order functions. I love higher order functions. They've always struck me as one of those where it's like a prime example of something I did not understand even a little bit until I did, and then I understood them very well. Well, let's not say very well, let's say decently. So there's a way to do this, but I don't remember it, so this is going to look a little weird to start before I kind of get my feet underneath me. So it was something like create an array called myArray and fill it with the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Excellent. And then something like variable myObject is equal to. Also, for any beginners who are still hanging around because they're feeling bold, objects have properties. Properties have keys and values. Best way to remember objects. Objects have properties. If I highlighted a property, the property itself has a key and a value. That's it. Okay. So what we would want to do is we want to write a function called each. Each is going to take in a collection and a callback function. And that right there is what makes it a higher order function. The fact that it has a function that is going to be either passed as a parameter or returned as a returned as a value. That's what makes it higher order. Yeah. Okay, so what we want to do is each is going to iterate over the collection, whether it's an array or an object, and it's going to apply the callback to every value within the function. Within the collection. So the first thing we would want to do is that our collection might be an array or it might be an object. So we'll say if collection is an array, iterate over the array, apply callback to each value. Otherwise, iterate over the object and apply callback to each, I guess it's value again. Okay, so if we have a collection, we want to figure out if the collection is an array, what method are we going to use? Excellent work. We're going to use the array.isArray method. We're going to say if array.isArray. We're going to call that on the collection. And we could also say is equal to true, but that's going to do the same thing as if we don't. All right, so let's make sure that our pseudocode looks nice and clean. That usually works. Okay. How do I get to the end of a line? Function, okay. All right, iterate over the array. So we're going to do this just with a simple for loop. Collection. Collection.length. Also, for those of you who thought that we were going to do actual higher order functions, we're building to that. And we're going to apply the callback. So what we're doing here is we're trying to take some of the mysticism away from callback from higher order functions, because once you get a sense of how they're built, which is to say we're going to build a bunch of them and then look at them, later on when you're messing with higher order functions in an actual live environment, it'll be a little easier to picture like, okay, this is the definition, and then this is like a call to that higher order function. Because when we say apply the callback, all we have to do is just write callback and then that. We've now applied the callback. And what we want to apply the callback to is every value in the collection. If we're iterating, we can just say collection at I. One of the things you're going to see a lot of people do is if I want the callback to be able to have access to not just the value, but also the index, which, maybe you do, you can just call it on I as well. A lot of times you'll also see it called on the entire collection, and that has implications that aren't important right now. So we're going to leave it just as collection at I. You know what? We're not doing the junior version. We're going to do the whole thing. So cool. So that's it for that. And then we're going to say for variable key and object. For anybody who has any let complaints about this, you're right. We could probably use let as well. Like that function. And we'll say apply callback. And then for this one, collection at I becomes collection. Oh boy, we're definitely not object up here. We got collection. So we want to say callback at collection at key. Give ourselves access to the key as well, and why not just the entire collection? So cool. So what we could do is we could say, now we want to do one of two things. Let's go over questions in the TAA module. Side note, the video is blurry. Oh no. Can I get anybody else to confirm the video is blurry? Because that's a... Oh, good. Perhaps that sorted itself out. Let's go over questions in the TAA module. Yeah, let's do that next. This won't take very long. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to make a call to each. We could say each, let's pass in my array, and then there's a couple things we could do. One of them is we could just say console.log. And the cool part about that is that console.log, because it's a function, if we say console.log and then call it like this, it actually applies that function. If we just leave it like this, it actually lists the definition of the function and works as such. Like it gets passed in as callback and does what it's supposed to. So it logs the value, the index, and the entire collection each time, which is fun, right? The other thing that we could do is, let's say we don't want a console.log, we want to console.log the value +1. So we could write a function, an anonymous function, inline, and the parameters of this are going to line up to what we're calling here. So whatever I want the collection at I to be called inside of my callback function, I can just name it. So I'll say something like val, and then maybe something like index, and then a lot of people will call the entire array itself, or the entire collection, the context. You don't need to do the formatting change that I just did, but you can. And so maybe we would say something like, oh, you rascal. We wouldn't say that. We would say console.log val +1, plus 16, why not? If we run that, Now, the reason, okay, so a lot of people will be like, hey, why did I lose I and collection? And the reason that I lost those is because I did not make any reference to the index or the context. It's a little weird, and it's one of those where the reason it works with console.log is because console.log is actually a function that expects any amount of parameters that you want to pass to it. So if you pass in more parameters than you planned for with console.log, it'll just separate them by a space. Whereas if you don't actively call index inside of here, we're not going to see it. I'm so lost but so intrigued. That might have more to do with the explanation than your ability to understand higher order functions, just as like a heads up. Okay, so one of the things that you could do from here is, what if I, because like, hey, I'm logging stuff to the console. Isn't that great? And it's like, well, no, it's not. I already knew how to log things to the console. What did I do all this for? And the reason we did each is because now we can use each to build all the rest of them. We're going to build one more, and then we'll go to a TAA question, and then maybe we'll come back. Where did you define the callback function? Right here. Inline. Hey, give me mine. There you go. This is the callback function. Like that is my defining the callback function. And what I can actually do instead of that, here's one version. That's with the callback function inline. So we'll say callback function defined, inline. And then we'll go ahead and copy all of this. Come on down here and we'll say callback function defined elsewhere. That's Alt. Sorry, that's me hitting what I think is the command button, but it's actually the Alt button, and so it doesn't do anything. So what we could do is we could actually pull this entire function out. I'll just go ahead and cut it and bring it down here. That's Alt again. Oh, you are going to be the death of me. Not really. So we'll say defined callback function. Now that we have a defined function, we're just going to grab the name and place it in here. And that's going to do the same thing. See how it does it twice because we called it twice here and here? Now, the last part of this that usually comes up right about now is it's like, why does this do what I just said it would? And the reason that it does is for this. We're going to say console.log definition of the function. That's just to give us a nice little identifier for it. And then we're going to put callback function here, like this. If we run this, you're going to see it actually lists the entire definition of the function. Oh, you scoundrel. Okay, so it's not supposed to do that. It's actually supposed to list out the entire thing. But that might be because I'm putting it in here with a string, and it's trying to, like, stringify it. Oh, Replit, you are the worst. All right, we're going to the console. Yeah, I know. All right, so this is going to be difficult to see unless I can actually make it bigger. I can make it bigger. Okay, so let's say console.log, console.log. These guys. All right, so we'll make a function A, and we'll just leave it like that. So now it's console.log. Okay, so we're getting closer. So it's trying to tell you, and what it's basically trying to do is just try not to scare you, but it actually ends up sort of botching the tutorial because we don't get to see it. But essentially what it ends up printing out is the definition of the function itself, rather than whatever the function would do when we call it. So let's go ahead and make this much smaller so it doesn't freak everybody out. Get rid of that, and go back to the questions. Yeah, scrolling up to the top so you can see what arguments you passed in the main function. I don't know what that means, but that's my being kind of nervous because it's like live and it's kind of nerve-wracking. Oh, good. Okay, cool. Jackpot. All right. So provided that this is not playing unfairly, which I would claim that it is, what it should say is this entire, it would basically say this. Like this thing highlighted here is the same as callback function. They both end up meaning the exact same thing, which is cool. Again, though, we're not really doing anything useful yet. We haven't actually been able to do anything that we couldn't just do with a console.log and a for loop. In fact, we're not going to, which is why I actually don't put any higher order functions in basic prep, is because you don't need them yet. And I think it's a better idea to learn what's going on and then learn higher order functions, almost the same way of like, you learn to peel potatoes and then you learn how to like make mashed potatoes with from scratch before you would go and I don't know start what do they do, like fried mashed potatoes, like you can do all kinds of crazy things with mashed potatoes, but if you don't know how to make them by scratch, you might end up in a problem later on if it's like, hey, you can make these by scratch, right? And they're like, oh no, I always get them instant. That's not really a good metaphor, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and comment all that out. Oh, for any PC people who have been asking me how to do that on a PC, that's how. You do control and then /, and it'll, if you've highlighted some code and you're in an editor that's being nice, it'll comment everything out so it doesn't work anymore. Or not doesn't work, but doesn't output anything. Let's make sure nothing's outputting. Cool. So now that we have each under our belt, each dovetails very nicely to something called map. Map is basically a way to save the calling of a function's result into an array. So think of like a map of an array to another array. So when we're doing map, we're going to make use of each. So the way that works is, let's first stub our function. We'll say function map. Map takes a collection and a callback. And I think what we're going to do is, now let's get to the end of map, just because map is pretty easy once we have each done. So what map does is map is going to make use of each in a really clever way. Well, it's not that clever. Whoever came up with it was clever. I'm just copying them. Say variable result is equal to an array. We're also going to assume that we're not mapping to an object. We're going to return the result. And here's where we're just going to make a call to each. Each is going to iterate over the collection and apply some callback. Now, what I want the callback to do is not just the callback. I want my each function's callback to take the current value, call the callback on that value, and then push the result into the array. There we go. So this is going to allow me to create a function called map, which could do something like, first we'll need a function, something like add1. Actually, we don't even need that because we can define that inline for map. So we'll say variable mapped is equal to map called on my array, and let's say function of val. Also, if you're here for arrow functions, you can keep on walking because I don't like arrow functions, but arrow function would be, you'll see them a lot with higher order functions because it does look pretty clean. So what I would say is we want to say something like return val, why not times 2? So if my array is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what do we think the resulting mapped array is going to look like? If I'm iterating over my array and I'm applying this each value times 2 function to every element of the array. And I want you guys to think about that just for a second, because if you don't know what's going to happen here, it's going to be way more difficult to understand the code. If you do know what's going to happen here, the code starts to become a little bit more like, oh, okay, so that's why I keep saying that. And also, I'm not going to wait for any answers just because I don't like making people call themselves out. So what I think is going to happen is it's going to return an array that has a doubled value from all the originals. It's actually not going to say anything because I didn't console.log anything yet. So if we console.log mapped, hooray! Part of me wants to keep going on this just because higher order functions discussed in more detail in the bonus prep modules. Yeah, they are. There's a couple challenges with each one of these, and they're in there. It's a what's it called, like a watershed kind of thing. You don't need them for the interview, so I don't like to make people learn them. There are a couple places in the course where they are featured. So there's a place in Module 2 introduces some higher order functions. You don't have to write them so much as just sort of like get a grasp of what's going on. But I have heard from people recently that they hit a brick wall at Module 2. So it might be about time to go back and write like Module 1.5 or something, just to get people a little bit more used to that, just because Module 2 sort of starts to give you a sense of just how rapidly things expand once you get out of like the the kiddie pool for JavaScript introduction materials. Things get pretty heavy pretty quickly. But that's the fun part though, right? Is because you figure it's like, hey, I don't really love learning JavaScript. It's like, yeah, but you might love designing websites. And if you learn JavaScript, then you might be able to get a job designing websites. So, or it's like, I love low-level programming. It's like, well, you might be able to end up with a low-level systems engineer type job starting with JavaScript, just because it's, kind of versatile. Okay. So, for those who are still here who are interested in more higher order function stuff, I think we might just need to postpone that for a little bit, at least for a couple of minutes, just because there was somebody who asked about questions in the TAA module. I don't want to call you out by name because I just don't do that, but for the person who asked about questions in the TAA module, is there a question specifically that you would like to go over? I'd love to help anybody who is like in a TAA, what's it called, approach, understand things a little bit better. The last one in the TAA module, might need a little more help on that, but it's also possible I know exactly what you're talking about because I added in a bunch of problems later. There were essentially just, I was on Code Wars and just kept like copying and pasting the problems into, because, why not? The last one. Oh, of course it's the last one. Do you mean this one? Extract domain name. No. Oh. Is there one after this? Question 48. Probably a question 48 in this one. I'm going in. Stop. Haha, okay, fashion inventory, part D. Yes? Yep, excellent. Oh, I love these questions. Okay, cool. The reason I love these questions is because if there was ever something that somebody would point to be like, hey, am I ready or am I not ready? It's like, do fashion inventory. If you can do fashion inventory, even if it takes you a while, you're probably ready. If you can't, you might want to take a little bit more time, to get more familiar with things. However, part D is particularly tricky. There is something that we're going to come across. Basically, when we try to find what word has lace in it, we have to do a couple of things in combination that you haven't usually done up to that point. Also, for those of you higher order function, people, maybe we'll try to make this into a higher order function result after we get it going with a for loop. Okay, so we got a bunch of stuff. Let's go over here and replit. Do we want a new one? Yeah, we want a new one. Select a language. Where's JavaScript? Dark side. Code intelligence disabled. Alright, we got a bunch of stuff we've got to put in here. And by a bunch of stuff, I mean I want to have a look at what the result should be. And I want to know what the input is. That's the output. Ooh, that's kind of cool. I like that. Well, let's leave the current inventory open just because it'd be a good idea to make sure that we can see that. So let's go back to the problem and we'll start it the way we should. You have a fashion catalog, an inventory of items from various high fashion designers. Each designer has a lineup of shoes. Each shoe has a name and a price. It looks like this. The task now is to find all the laced shoes, but we are going to render them in a somewhat complex format. Your function should return shoe names that contain lace in them and indicate which word contains lace. The return values format should be structured like this. Also, it's like, why would you structure it like this? The answer is literally to see if you can do what's necessary to make the answer look like this. There's no underlying like, oh, in computer science, we always like to make really weird looking objects with target word indexes that don't line up with, it's not like that. It's just, can you make what we're asking happen here? And that's the case for a lot of the problems. Okay, so generate lace details. Oh, and that's it. That's all they're giving us. All right, fine. Be that way. we'll come over here. First thing we always want to do is start with a top to bottom kind of like analysis of what's going on and see if we can just get our heads wrapped around a generic approach that we might take. So if we look at the expected result, it looks like it's an array. So the first thing might be create a result array. And then at the end, return the result array. Cool. So we're halfway there. Well, not really, but we're close. Then it looks like there is an object for each shoe that contains lace. So if I know that there's an object for each shoe that contains lace, I know that I probably want to look at every shoe. If I want to look at every shoe, I might want to go back and have a look at the way that the current inventory is set up. And it appears that we've got 2 designer objects. Each of those has a shoe property, which is an array of shoes. So the first thing that I might do is iterate over the designers. Once I've iterated over the designers, I might iterate over the shoes for the current designer. Then I might do something like if current shoe contains lace, and here's where we're going to do something called wishful programming. We're going to say make the result object. Oh, come back. Oh, of course. Sorry, that's my other computer where I'm doing Slack, and it shut down because I haven't been paying attention to it for a while. Okay, we're back. So, make the result object and push it to result array. So cool. So, you know, a lot of times problems like this can seem really difficult until you start, chipping away at them like this. Now, agreed, this one's going to get difficult, and we'll get to it in a second. But for right now, it's like, that's the problem, right? It's written out there on lines 59 through 65. Create a result array. Iterate over the designers. Iterate over the shoes for the current designer. If the current shoe contains lace, make the result object, push to the result, return the result at the end. Now, of course, it's going to be a little bit more difficult than that. But for the most part, if you're ever stuck, you want to try to come back to problems that you've done before and solve them like this. Write pseudocode out that gives you a way to identify how easy the problems you've been doing are compared with the level of skill that you've developed. So, a couple ways to do this. I like to get some code on the page first. People disagree with me about that, but I'm the one on the keys. Say result equals empty object, return the result, iterate over the designer is going to be a nice little for loop. And we're going to do a couple of aliases. We're gonna name things a little easier for us to reference later. Go on. Oh, come on. And our aliases are going to be something like variable shoes is equal to inventory at i.shoes. So rather than having to say inventory at shoes, we'll just say shoes, and it'll know what we mean because we've created this alias. So the next thing we'll do is we'll say for variable j is equal to 0, j is less than shoes.length, j plus plus. Oh gosh, go back. And I know this is very mechanical, but I'd rather do that than delete things or get into insert mode like I did before. Okay, so if the current shoe contains lace, what would be a good way for us to check to see if a shoe that is a string contains the word lace? Now, it might be laced or it might be lace up, but is there a way for us to determine that both of those are valid? In fact, there is. We could say if, and we actually did this earlier, which is why I'm kind of being facetious about it, but the index of operator is going to be nice and clean for us on this one. So we'll say if shoes at j. We could probably create another alias here too. We could say something like variable current shoe is equal to shoes at j. But current shoe is way longer than shoes at j, so maybe let's just call it shoe. Show. I don't know if you guys have had this happen yet, but when you program for a while and you keep looking at words, but you see them as code and not actual words, they start to look kind of weird. First one that happened to me with that was book. It kept looking like book. I don't know why. Maybe something about the way your brain's working when you're doing this kind of stuff. Let's go ahead and make this just shoe. So we'll say shoe, which is going to be the actual shoe. It'll have a name, which is this guy right here. Nice little string, says some things about the shoe. We want to say shoe.name dot index of lace. And if that is greater than or equal to, or sorry, greater than -1, and that has to do with the way that index of returns. If lace isn't found, index of is going to give us -1. So if it's greater than -1, then we know that the index inside of the shoe's name, where we see lace, is some valid index within that string. So the reason I wrote some code is because I want to make sure that the structure that I've got so far is going to work, because once I have this, it only becomes an issue of solving how do I create one of those result objects. It's not how do I do it to all of them, because all the code that I've written is going to do something now to all of the shoes. And in fact now on line 70, I'm going to basically console.log the shoe. I want to say it's like, hey, is this going to give me all of the shoes with lace in it? And if it isn't, we'll go back and solve that before we go on to the more complicated issue of generating the actual object that needs to be here. Let's run, see what happens. Of course. So what is going wrong? Obviously what's going wrong, I don't want to say obviously, I make this mistake all the time. What's going wrong is that I have not actually called my function. So what I'll do is call it. Let's just assume that we have something that's close to inventory as the name, but we'll scroll up at, okay, current inventory. Come on. So if we run this, let's see what happens. Okay, so I would suggest that those are all of the lace shoes. Does anybody have an issue with that? I think those are all the lace. We only got 2 moccasins that aren't laced. All the rest of them are laced. So at this point, we have successfully gotten a function to iterate over this relatively complex data set and look at all of the shoes and tell me which ones have lace in them. So now, I want to take this and somehow translate it into, where is it at? This. So I want the name, I want to take the name and break it up into an array. And then I want to find the index in that array where there is a word that has lace inside of it. Which seems reasonable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this object because I want a copy of it. The reason I want a copy of it is because it's going to be easier to plan what we're going to... My goodness, would you just scroll already? It's going to be easier to plan what we're going to do if we have that around. So we're going to make a multi-line comment. That's how you do that. And then we'll paste in our by hitting the actual button we're supposed to. Alright, so everybody just relax. Let's move this over. And I'm going to try this. I think it's Control-Shift square bracket to the right. Or just Control square bracket to the right. Ah, cool. Okay. Could you? Alright, good. So, a couple things jump out. One is, we need an object. We need an object that has a name words key and a target word index key. It would be helpful if the name words keys value was an array that contained these words. So we might just organize it like that, right? Let's do something like variable result object is equal to an array. And inside of that, we'll say name words. I'm going to forget how to write this all of a sudden. Name words, and we'll put something here. And then target word index, and let's put null for now. So to give ourselves an array that's going to be a result of the name being split on a space, because that's the other thing, is that if you get good at those transition methods, when I see this compared to this, to me it's like, oh, that's just split on a space. So let's just split it on a space. Boy, that's a really weird function. Okay, so name words, we're going to say, where is it? Shoe.name.split on a space. Now, some people disagree with me on this one as well, but what I'm also going to do at this point is once I create that, I'm going to... Wait, I'm missing a curly brace here. No, I'm not. Curly brace there. I think this thing is messing me up. So let's push our result object into the result. We'll say result.push result object. So now let's see what happens. All right. This is going to be a little bit easier, more difficult to parse, but we'll move this over and just have a look. All right, so this is looking pretty clean, right? Name words has where it's supposed to be, and target word index is null, but all we would need to do is just go over name words, figure out where lace is, and then put that in here, which seems reasonable. A couple ways to do that. Easiest way is just a for loop. So what we'll do is right here, I'm going to say for variable k is equal to 0. K is less than, and it needs to be less than result object dot name words, because that's the array, right? The name words array is the one that we want to iterate over, and so we can do so by just putting it in here like this. Say name words dot length k plus plus. So here's where we're going to say something like if, and then the current word. We might want to do something like that where we say like current name word. This is where aliases start to get a little bit like, you're almost better just writing out the whole thing, but that's okay. Current name word is equal to result object dot name words at k. Name words at k is going to be, the tasseled green low top lace up. One of them is going to have lace inside of it. So if we do that, we could say if current name word dot index of lace, again, is greater than -1. Now here's where we can kind of mess with some things that can be fun. What is it that we want to do if we find out where lace is? Because the function's over at that point. Like, we have all of the things that we need. So we're going to do a couple things. One is we're going to say result object dot target word index is equal to, and I think it's just k at this point, right? Because if we're at the current index of k and we find out that that name word has lace in it, that's the index where that's like our target word index. So we say result object dot target word index is equal to k, and then we're going to say something called break. Break just means stop the for loop. At that point, I believe we are in good shape, as it were. Is the interview coding done on an actual compiler or something like Google Docs? I think it's done on something like a compiler. I got to imagine it's going to be something similar to this, except the problems you see me facing will be removed mostly because Replit is set up to let you code in almost any language, whereas the interview or the technical admissions assessment or whatever, they know you're doing JavaScript. So it's usually set up to kind of give you a, what would you call it? I don't think that they want the coding environment to be a factor. I think they it's going to be pretty similar to what you've been, using before, especially if you've been messing around with Replit at all. Okay, so I think that's it. Now, I know we went away from the pseudocode for a little bit, and that's my fault because I do that. For the person who asked about this question, if my explanation today has been insufficient, which is entirely possible, you want to figure that if you go to Module 2, Part D of the problem section for fashion inventory, there should be a video of me doing that problem, and I'd like to think that it might be a little bit better. So if you have trouble understanding what went on today, which is, again, entirely possible because I tend to talk in circles, please feel free to check that out. Or, of course, send me a DM. That's also the other thing, is that if you're ever around and you just want to be like, hey, could you, this is the point that I'm having trouble with. At the end of the day, I mostly just want to see people get better at this stuff if they want to be. But we're doing the sum up part and we haven't figured out if we did this correctly yet. So let's go ahead and click run. All right, so let's come back up here. Now what we should have done is we should have written a, some kind of nice, compare two objects, assertion function. And we could write that if you want to, but I don't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just look. So name words, it's in an object, target word index of 3. Okay, looking good. Target index word of 3, 2, 2. All right, cool. That seems pretty reasonable. For the person who asked about that question, good. Thank you for the help. Although that doesn't answer the question of if this sorted things out. Do you feel as though the issue you were having has been satisfied? Also, never feel like you have to answer me in those questions or those scenarios. A lot of time I'm just trying to set up a break so I can take a sip of water. Are any higher order function aficionados still here? Uh, oh, good. No, that to be sure, when I say issue, I literally just mean like something that would prompt me to do something in response. Like it doesn't have to be like a problem or you're having trouble. It's like a ticket almost, rather than any problem. Although I guess we only have 4 minutes left for the amount of time I usually schedule for this. If there are any higher order aficionados around, one of the things I used to do as kind of like to mess with students, because one of the things you do on an interview, if you're an interviewer, is you want to make sure the person knows how to JavaScript, basically. But you also want to make sure that if they are presented with something that isn't perfectly within their wheelhouse, that they don't lose their little mind, because that's going to happen during the immersive. The immersive is very, very difficult, and for reasons we went over, but also for reasons of just it's a difficult task. The fun part is that if you're with people that have the right attitude, which is what we screen for, it's one of the most transformative and life-changing experiences you could do. And that's probably true of any coding boot camp that does some, rigorous screening of students coming in. I don't think it's necessarily just a Hack Reactor or a Galvanized thing. It's just if you get quality students in a condensed area with a focused goal and similar enthusiasm, like good stuff happens. So what we were trying to do at that point, if somebody got through all the higher order functions, which sometimes they would do it because they were brilliant, other times they did it because everybody found out that's what our interview was, so they just memorized those functions, I would ask them to implement filter using reduce, which you really got to know how reduce works to make that happen. So if anybody's ever looking for kind of like a, bouncing your head off the walls, kind of like things that are below the, heavy algorithm stuff, but above the basics, implement filter, like a version of filter that uses reduce. It's one of those where it's like afterwards you're kind of like, is there anything reduce can't do? And it's like, not really. It's pretty versatile. Is it acceptable to run our code occasionally to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to? And I'm assuming this means during the TAA. Before getting too deep into the answer, in most of your videos you code the entire thing out before running it, but when I do that I'm bound to make a lot of errors. So I usually like to check it throughout. What do you suggest for the interview? During the interview, I would suggest something called tactical console.logging if you find yourself running the code, which is to say, if you run the code before it's complete, you want to describe, at least to yourself, but probably also out loud, why am I running the code at this point? What do I expect to have happen? And what am I going to do if that's the case? Now, you don't have to answer all of that all the time, but that's a good idea to get in the habit of like, anytime you do something in programming, make sure you have a good idea of why you're doing it. And the reason could be because I have no idea what I'm doing and I need to just see something to get myself going. It's like, hey, say that. Because you figure if you're working with somebody and they say that, you have a lot of wiggle room on what you can do to assist them, or you have a lot of at least context on why they're doing what they're doing. But if they just start running their function every 5 seconds, it could be a little bit like, okay, like, did you practice? And it's not a definitive thing. It's kind of just like it leans the opinion of the interviewer in a direction away from which you would want them to lean, which is we want to let you in. Like we want students to come to the school and get educated and change their lives. We're looking for an excuse most of the time to do that. Now, of course, it's a lot of money, it's really stressful, and it's not easy. So there's, of course, very, very hard guidelines when it comes to like what you have to be able to do. But beyond that, it tends to be the case of like, do you think this person could get this in rapid fashion? Because that's what Hack Reactor is. It's like 3 months to get what takes people ordinarily 2 to 3 years to do. And, it's like, wow, how could you do that? It's like, it'll be the hardest thing you've ever done. But you'll leave with such an improved appreciation of how fast you can learn things. I'll give you an example. I did the program in something called Ruby, a programming language called Ruby. It was also taught partially in JavaScript. I then taught the course the next round, which was all JavaScript, and now primarily I work in Python, just because it's mostly just like script writing, because I don't actually have like a programming job necessarily, besides the streams and stuff. But you want to figure that all that is possible because at a certain point in my life, I was like, yo, let me see what I could actually do in 3 months. And you get in the same room as a bunch of other people. And by room, I literally just mean in contact with, because one of the best people I ever worked with was somebody who had come to the program after being in the remote version. And something about having to organize your own space to be involved in that, I think gives people an edge. That a lot of people, when they think, oh, remote, it shouldn't be as expensive, or it's not as good. It's like, well, no, it's different, but there's definitely a lot of benefit to the remote program. Robin, if you ever see this, shout out. He's one of my favorite people. He still works here too. I think he's in the remote program. All right, cool. So it is 7:31, and I am extremely lazy, and as a result, usually kind of count down to 7:31 to see if anything is, ready to leave. However, I haven't streamed in a couple of weeks, so if there's any questions, or if anybody was like, "Hey, I got another real quick thing I'd love to bounce off of somebody," I would love to help you out with that. So I'm going to stick around for another couple minutes, and see if anybody has any questions. Oh, it's my pleasure. I thoroughly enjoy doing this. I was kind of disappointed I wasn't able to last time, but I couldn't risk breaking my, only, well, it wasn't my only computer, but like the computer I have all of my work stuff on. I didn't want to risk breaking that by like streaming on it and having it, well, I don't know, melt. Because man, it was boiling. But actually, I got a PC. I've never really had a PC before, and I've always kind of wanted to do some stuff with Linux. Actually, on the YouTube channel is a 40-minute video of me installing VirtualBox and then an installation of Xubuntu to try to install Linux on a virtual machine, which is kind of suggested if you want to use a PC while you're going through the program. But it's difficult, and so that's why I had somebody who knows nothing about Linux or PCs, do it, because it's, you've chosen the path of pain if you decide to use Linux for it and you never used it before, but you come out on the other end with Linux is almost like a ticket to like instant respect among developers. It's like if you're a Linux person, you tend to get a little bit of like a the nod, like the sage nod with like, ah, yes, another, what is it? Huzzah, a man of quality. Like that's kind of what goes on. Oh, and again, it's my pleasure. I'm so glad that even if like one or two people show up to this stream, to me it's like oh yes. Like, how can this code be modified to account for negative numbers? And we've got a version of modulo that looks pretty good. I love alternative ways to solve modulo. Modulo is one of my favorite questions just because it's really difficult to figure out how to do that off the top of your head. I don't mean really difficult, it's just, it is considerably more difficult than a lot of the other stuff that goes on. And, it never hurts to look at a function like that after you wrote it and was like, oh wow, I killed this. Okay, I'm going to iterate down, number one, turn one. All right. Ooh, how can I do this? Here's the problem that I'm facing is that Slack is not on the same computer where I'm actually working right now. So I can't copy and paste your code, but I could probably just write it in. So this is going to be a little bit slower. If anybody has any fast Twitch questions, which is to say like something you think could happen quickly, feel free to holler. But let's see if we can figure this out, because to be sure, the answer that I would give you is that if this function works for positive numbers, you're going to want to do something like, it'll look like this. Or, go on then, buddy. Well, never mind. So let's come down here. So, you got your function going, you're doing a bunch of stuff, and what I would say is, you want an if statement somewhere around like line 13. And I know for the video this is not going to make any sense, but if you go back to the general chat and you check this out, also to be sure, this is kind of this is a question that I think is better for people who have done what this person who's asking the question has done, and otherwise you probably just want to solve it on your own, because that's the fun part. But for those of you watching the stream and expecting new content to happen after this point in the stream, you should probably sign off now. This is the warning that everything from here on is going to be a little bit esoteric and difficult to understand because you won't be able to see it all. But for the person asking this, I think it should be helpful. So it was hard but super rewarding. Yeah, right? A lot of things are like that. It's on your YouTube. It's on your YouTube. Now, yeah, that's the thing, right? The YouTube is also on the Mac. Like, I don't have YouTube open on what's it called? On the computer where I'm actually streaming the stuff. But real quick, line 13, you could put in a check, something to be like, if num1 is less than 0, then create a flag that says result should be negative. And here's what that looks like. You say something like variable result is equal to, result is negative is equal to false. We assume that it starts as false. And then we say if num1 is less than 0, then we're going to say something like result is negative is equal to true, and then maybe something like num1 is equal to math.abs of num1. And that's going to give you the absolute value. If you don't remember how to use absolute value, we can just say negative num1, because if it's, you don't have to put this in parentheses either. That's just doing that for some reason. We could do that, or we could do math.abs of num1. Then at the end, when you're about to return, rather than returning num1, you say if result is negative, return negative num1, otherwise return num1. So to the person who asked that, did that explanation kind of help things out? Do you get what I'm saying with the whole like flag thing? I think line 13 ought to do it for you. You want to figure like line, because if num1 on line 20 is giving you the right answer, then if you go to line 13 and you say, and that's where you do the expression about num1, that's what I would suggest. Let me know how that goes. DM me or send another message at some point if that doesn't work. Well, I don't want to leave in the middle of a question. Given a list of non-negative integers and a target sum, find a pair of numbers that sums to the target sum. Cool. Well, there's a relatively straightforward way to do this, and I'm going to do that because, well, I'm not that good at this stuff. So it's usually like it's like I'm going to do the simple way is a convenient way of my saying like I don't know how to do the fancy ways and stuff. We'll go no, not soft wrapping, disabled. Okay. Let's say function find pair for sum integers target. Ooh, starting to get a little better with the keys. Variable pair is equal to and what do we got? 3, 34, 4, 12, 5, 2, and then they want us to sum to 9. Good Lord. And then console.log pair. Excellent. Might be a little big. Okay, so there's probably a couple of ways to do this, but again, we're going to do the easy one. So if we have the result of this is an array, we should write this down here. They want us to have an array that has this. Integers is an array, but it's not likely that we're going to do it in place. We're probably not going to get rid of stuff out of integers. We're going to create a new array. So we'll say create a result array, return the result array at the end. Now, if I've got something like this, all I'm going to do is just iterate over the array twice. I'm going to say iterate over integers and then iterate over integers. Now, there's better ways to do this, but this will get it done. And so what I would suggest is, especially entering the technical additions assessment, if you can find a way to get the answer, do that. Now, you don't want to hard code. You don't want to say something like, if the input is this array and the sum target is 9, then return 4 and 5. Brute force is usually different than hard coding, but sometimes people conflate the two. So we'll say variable result is equal to, and you know what? We use result too much. Let's say pair. So we'll say variable pair is equal to that. We're already using pair. Let's use result. So we'll say return result array at the end. Return result. Iterate over the integers. I is equal to 0. I is less than integers dot length. Plus. Also, I keep having to hunt and peck, like look down at the keys each time I do a lot of these things because I managed to get into insert mode like earlier. So that's my current excuse for the poor typing. There's also very possibly a reason to not say j is equal to 0. Like we could say something like j is equal to I plus 1 or something, so that it iterates slightly more efficiently. But I don't care about that. I is less than integers dot length. Dissimilar to other examples you might see, it's not integers at I dot length. We're not iterating over an inner array. We're just iterating over the same array twice And that's so that we can, generate combinations, basically. Okay. So now we want to just say, like, if current integers are not the same and add up to target, then return, we can do one of two things. We could return the array directly here, or we could push them into pair. Since we've already created, well, not pair, push them into result. So we'll say push current integers into result. So what that looks like is we might set up something like if I is equal to j, then we'll say something like continue. Continue just means go to the next iteration, whereas break, of course, would mean stop completely. So if they're the same, just go to the next one. And then we get to the meat of things. We'll say if integers at I, go on then, plus integers at j, triple equals target, we are, as they would say, in business. At which point we want to say something like result.push integers at I, integers at j. Also, if you didn't know that, you can push stuff by using commas that way. And I think that should be it. Fine. So what we need to do here is something like return result, maybe. Cool. How else could we do that? Say something like, we could put a break statement here and a break statement here. Oh gosh, come on, back up. I think that should do it. Of course not. No, we don't want one there. All right, never mind. We're just going to return result directly here. And since we're returning it directly, let's just go ahead and return an array, literal, with the two values we want inside. Jackpot. Cool. So hopefully that was helpful for the person who asked for that. If it was not, my sincere apologies. I think that this problem is, wait, I'm not sure that this problem is in the course. But if it is, cool. If not, excellent. Looks like there was a slightly positive result, which is good news. So I am officially tired, but there is somebody still typing, so I want to give that person a chance to finish their thought if they have one. Do we have to keep the return result at the bottom? No. We can go ahead and get rid of that. Because as you see, we're returning it directly here. The problem would be if we had a situation where a number, we're looking for a target that isn't there, our function is not going to return anything. It's going to sort of like just sputter out. So you might end up putting something like return, after the iteration is done, a target sum not found. And this speaks to an important point about conditionals and for loops, which is that every time you write a for loop, there's something true before, during, and after you write that for loop. Part of it is explicit in terms of, I being less than the integer's length each time. But we can also say that while these are still iterating, we still might find the target sum. What's more important than that is that what's happened after the for loop is over, we know for a fact that we haven't found, that there doesn't exist a target, like two numbers that can add up to the target. And we know that because of the way that we set up the for loop. So keep that in mind. And yeah. A couple of weeks off made me completely lose all of my sign-off ability. I was getting better at that by the end of the last streams of wrapping these up. But anyway, let me know if anybody needs any assistance with anything. If you have any questions, always feel free to DM me or ask in the channels. We'll see you next week. Thanks to everyone who showed up and asked questions. Thank you to anybody who also showed up and didn't ask questions. If you have any suggestions about the course or about any of the videos or any stuff in there, always feel free to holler. It's entirely, for a while now, just been some student will come to me and be like, hey, what about this? And it's like, yeah, sure, let's do that. It's actually really easy to affect this course, so how often is office hours? I do them every Wednesday at 6:30, except for the last like 4 weeks in a row because I was a little bit ill for a while, and then my computer decided to be like, nah, dude, we're not streaming anymore. It's like, really? It was like, well, I could die if you wanted me to. So we stopped streaming. But now we're back. We've got a little bit of like a semblance of an ability to stream. So probably going to try to keep doing these, weekly. If there's another time that it's like, man, I really wish he was streaming at this time, definitely feel free to holler about that. But other than that, ask in the channels. I think that the general tendency of the channels is to help people as opposed to like belittle, which you sometimes get in message boards. Ooh, that's an important thing to mention. If you ever feel like you are being harassed, targeted by somebody in these, it almost never happens, but every once in a while it does. So I like to throw out a quick reminder. It is absolutely against the rules, and we have a zero tolerance policy for that. So be careful DMing each other. Like, I would hate for somebody to get kicked out for something they thought was innocent, but I tend to have more of a, nah, you're gone approach to those sort of things. So when in doubt, message the channel. If you send a message to the channel that isn't perfect, I'll delete it and send you a message explaining why. Oh no, I totally feel better. That was like weeks ago. Like it was like 3 weeks ago I canceled the stream because it was just not feeling well that day. But I appreciate your sentiments, and like I did. Cool. So let's see if we can figure out how to end this. Thanks to everyone who came, and no, it's not this one. It's the other one. It's like, yeah, this one.